In the forgotten corners of old Vietnam, where fog clings low and banana trees rustle like whispers from the dead, there are stories that are never told aloud, not because they've been lost, but because the living are too afraid to remember. Faint sound of dripping water, slow creak of wood. This is one of them. A tale of a widow who did not weep, a forest that devoured souls, and a curse that lingers in the teeth of the dead. You see, in some villages, death isn't the end. Not when shadows are sewn into dolls, not when mirrors remember faces long buried, and not when teeth still chatter beneath the floorboards, even after the coffin's nailed shut. Tonight, FolkFear invites you to step into the Red River Delta, into a village that has been bleeding for decades, where the well runs red every 7th year, and no one dares to speak the widow's name. But one woman has returned, and the spirits are waiting. The road home was narrower than she remembered. Lan sat stiffly in the back of the rusting van as it jolted over the cracked path that wound through fields of dry, brittle stalks. The driver hadn't spoken since they left the paved road behind an hour ago. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't need to. There was only one destination at the end of this forgotten road, and no one went there unless they had to. The Red River shimmered in the distance, swollen and brown, as if nursing something deep and unspoken beneath its currents. The air was thick, not hot exactly, but heavy, like something was watching her from the tree line, something patient. She rolled the window down. The wind smelled of banana leaves and old earth, familiar but not comforting. Her phone vibrated once, then died. No signal. Of course not. When the van finally slowed, Lan saw the faded marker stone jutting from the grass, half swallowed by creeping moss. The village name had been carved long ago in characters now chipped and nearly illegible. Even the stone looked ashamed to still be here. The driver didn't help her with her bags. He just muttered, "Go quickly, don't stay past dark," before turning the van around without looking back. Lan stood alone with her suitcase, staring down the dirt path ahead. The village of Yung Yin had once been her childhood summer, filled with muddy river baths, fermented rice cakes, and whispered stories told in the glow of fireflies. But now the trees leaned too far inward, the silence was too thick, and the stories felt unfinished. She walked. The first house she passed was shuttered. So was the next, and the one after that. Some were overrun with weeds. Some had small red paper talismans stuck crookedly to their doors, edges curling with time. Not a soul in sight, except one. An old woman squatted in the shade of a crumbling porch. Her back was to Lan, but as Lan passed, the woman turned her head slightly, just enough for Lan to see her left eye was milky white. The other eye was sharp, too sharp. She said nothing, but she made a slow gesture with her hand. 2 fingers pointed toward her own mouth, and then closed them into a fist. Lan's steps quickened. Her grandmother's house sat near the end of the village, just before the trees swallowed the path into the forest. It hadn't changed. The black-tiled roof still dipped in the middle. The courtyard still held the same stone water basin, but the air around it felt colder, despite the sun. The front door creaked open before she could knock. Standing there was Ba Tum, not bent, not frail, not quite what Lan expected. Her grandmother wore a dark gray ao baba and a wide-brimmed hat of woven straw. Her skin was parchment thin, but her eyes were clear, sharper than they had any right to be at her age. She looked at Lan as if seeing a stranger, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. "You came," Ba Tum said. Lan swallowed. "You wrote. You said you were dying." "I am," the old woman said simply, stepping aside. "But not fast enough." Lan stepped into the house. The scent hit her instantly. Mold, dried herbs, old incense, and something metallic beneath it all. The walls were lined with red-lacquered portraits of ancestors, each with their eyes covered by a thin strip of silk. She tried to speak again, but something made her stop. There was a sound, faint, a clicking, like ceramic against ceramic, repeated, rhythmic. Lan turned. "What is that?" Ba Tom didn't answer. She simply walked deeper into the house, her footsteps making no sound at all. That night, Lan couldn't sleep. She lay in the old guest room, the mosquito net hanging limp above her. The mattress was thin and filled with the rustle of rice husks. The walls creaked. The wind pressed gently against the windows, then stopped mid-breath. The clicking continued. She followed it, barefoot, careful, down the hallway, past the ancestral altar, toward the sealed door near the kitchen. She remembered that door. It had always been locked. Even as a child, she'd been warned never to open it. The clicking came from behind it now. She pressed her ear to the wood. Click, 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 click. Then silence. A breath on her neck. She turned sharply. Nothing. But on the floor behind her, something had been left. A single human tooth, slightly yellowed, wrapped in a tiny strand of red thread. She stared. She did not touch it. In the morning, the air was thicker. She stepped outside to fetch water and noticed something strange in the well. The rope had been cut clean through as if by a blade. The bucket was gone. A neighbor, an old man with clouded eyes, stood nearby watching her. His lips moved, but no sound came. She approached him. "Do you know what happened to the well?" The man stared at her for a long moment, then raised a trembling hand to his face. He opened his mouth wide. Inside was nothing. No tongue, no teeth, just a dark, glistening void. Lan stumbled back in horror. The man smiled, if it could be called that, and turned away. Back in the house, Ba Tum sat at the altar, arranging incense with long, bony fingers. "You shouldn't have come," she said without turning. Lan stood behind her, shaken. "Did you tell me that something was wrong with this place?" Ba Tum lit the incense. The smoke curled in slow, unnatural spirals, shapes that looked like claws in the light. "This place isn't wrong," she said quietly. "It is simply unfinished." Lan said nothing, until her eyes landed on a sealed clay jar placed beside the altar, tied tightly in black silk. The surface was etched with old Taoist markings, and something that looked disturbingly like teeth pressed from the inside. "What is that?" Ba Tum looked at her at last. "A story you were born into, and one you cannot leave unfinished." As dusk fell, the frogs refused to sing. The shadows grew longer than they should have. And in the attic above her room, Lan found something wrapped in funeral cloth, a mirror cracked straight down the middle, a headless straw doll sewn with black thread, and a tooth tucked in a silk pouch. The pouch was embroidered with her name. Lan awoke to the sound of burning paper, soft, crackling, deliberate. The sun hadn't risen yet, but a faint gray light filtered through the bamboo shutters. The smell of smoke, bitter, sweet, and strangely floral, curled through the house like a question waiting to be asked. She pulled on her sweater, barefoot against the cold wooden floor, and followed the sound. In the courtyard, Pa Tum knelt on a woven mat, feeding joss paper into a clay brazier. Yellow talismans, silver strips, and red ghost money curled into ash as they vanished into the flames. Her face was still, almost tranquil. Lan watched in silence, uncertain whether to speak. There was a rhythm to it, a ritual, not just a morning prayer, but something older, something binding. After a long moment, Patam finally spoke. "They're hungrier than they used to be." Lan blinked. "Who is?" The old woman didn't answer. She dropped a final piece of paper into the fire, this one shaped like a tongue. They ate breakfast in near silence. The soup was thin, bitter melon floating in a cloudy broth. No meat, no salt, no questions. Lan sipped quietly, but her eyes kept drifting to the doorway, where the strange jar wrapped in black silk sat nestled in shadow. It hadn't moved, but she could still hear it. Click, click, click. Patam's chopsticks paused. "You hear them?" Lan's stomach clenched. "The jar," she said. "What's inside?" Her grandmother looked at her then, not with anger, but with something colder. Memory. "They are not what's inside," Patam said softly. "The jar is what holds them back." Later that morning, Lan wandered the village alone. She needed air and distance and silence not filled with clicking teeth. But the village did not welcome her. Children ran from her, doors closed in her shadow. One house had red string wrapped tightly around the gate. Another had a rooster's foot nailed to the post, fresh blood still dripping. She passed the school, empty. She passed the shrine, deserted. Then, near the edge of the banana grove, she saw a group of old women gathered under a tree. They were sewing, in silence. Their fingers moved in perfect rhythm, weaving thread through scraps of black and white cloth. As Lan drew closer, she realized what they were making. Dolls. Funeral dolls. Not the kind offered for peace, but the kind bound with names. Some had coins for eyes. Some had straw-stuffed bellies. All had one thing in common: no mouths. As Lan stared, one of the women looked up. Her eyes were milky, her lips stitched shut with red thread. She reached into her satchel and slowly held out a tiny pouch. Lan took it with trembling fingers. Inside was a baby tooth, wrapped in silk, with a stitch of pink thread through the center. She looked up again, but the women were already gone, as if they had never been there. Back at the house, Lan confronted her grandmother. She held up the pouch. "Why do these women have my teeth?" Patam was crushing dried herbs with a stone mortar. She didn't look up. "You lost it here when you were 6, fell on the porch, split your lip." "That doesn't explain—" "I kept it," the old woman said simply. "It's dangerous to leave the body unguarded, especially pieces that fall on holy ground." Lan stared at her. "Holy ground?" Her grandmother finally looked up. Her voice was low, cold. "This house was built on binding soil, once used for war dead, ashes soaked into the clay. That makes it a gate, and gates must be guarded." She walked slowly to the altar, picked up a long brass needle, held it between her fingers like a bone. "I've spent my whole life sewing the gates shut, with hair, with teeth, with thread and shadow." Lan's voice trembled. "Is that what the jar is, a gate?" "No." A pause. "It's a prison." That night, Lan dreamed of a hallway without doors. She was walking barefoot, carrying a jar of black silk in her hands, but it was growing heavier. With each step, the jar clicked louder. The silk unraveled. Something inside began to push outward, pressing against the lid, tapping, tapping. Ahead of her, the hallway ended at a mirror. But her reflection was wrong. The mirror showed a woman in a red wedding dress, face half burned, mouth full of bloodied teeth. She was smiling, and she whispered, "We are still waiting." Lan awoke, gasping. There on her pillow lay another tooth, still wet. She ran to the altar room. The silk was looser around the jar. The brass binding nail had fallen to the floor, and for the first time she could see inside. Teeth. Dozens of them. Not thrown in, but placed carefully, with red thread sewn into the root. Some were child-sized, others clearly adult, some blackened, some cracked, all humming softly. Click, click, click. She felt sick. "Whose are these?" she whispered. From behind her, Pa Tom spoke. "Ghost brides, or what's left of them." She turned. "You killed them?" "I bound them," her grandmother said, "when no one else would." She walked forward slowly, eyes distant. After the war, there were so many restless, wives who never saw their husbands return, brides buried in borrowed coffins, spirits with no name, no prayers, no rest. She came to me, or were brought, to be laid to rest, but rest requires offerings, threads, teeth, names, and sometimes a child who never should have been born. Lan's breath caught in her throat. "You mean—" The old woman looked up at her, gaze unflinching. "I gave what I had to give." Lan fled the room. Outside, the air had turned sharp. The banana trees rustled without wind. The sky was too dark for afternoon, and from the edge of the forest, she swore she saw a figure in red, walking backward into the trees. That evening, Lan packed her bag. She couldn't stay here, not in this house, not with jars of teeth, not with funeral dolls, not with shadows that whispered her name. But when she reached the road, the path was gone, swallowed by mist. The moss-covered marker stone had split clean down the middle, and the earth beneath it bled like flesh. She turned to run, and found herself back at the front door, as if the village had folded in on itself, trapping her inside. Pa Tom stood in the doorway. "You tried to leave." Lan's voice was hoarse. "This place is cursed." Her grandmother's eyes softened, just slightly. Curses are just promises kept too long. Then she stepped aside, letting Lan in. The house groaned as the wind pushed at the shutters, and somewhere below, beneath the wooden floorboards, a jar of teeth began to click, faster than before. Lan didn't leave her room that night. She couldn't. Something had changed. The house no longer creaked in old, familiar ways. The wood sighed like lungs. The shadows along the corners of the walls stretched toward her bed and never quite receded. And that jar, she could hear it again. Click, 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 click. She covered her ears. It didn't help. When morning came, she didn't speak to her grandmother. She ate a bowl of congee in silence and slipped away before the last bite. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to be somewhere the past hadn't touched. But the village had no such place. Even the trees looked older now, gnarled, dark, covered in veiny vines that trembled when you passed them. The ground was dry, yet her shoes left no prints. Time here did not move forward. It circled. It fed. She ended up in the attic. She hadn't been there since she was a child, when the air was filled with rat droppings, heat, and the sweet smell of dried jackfruit skins hanging from the rafters. Now it was cold and too clean. Everything was wrapped in cloth, bundles of forgotten things, offerings, wedding dowries, funeral robes never delivered. She found a box, carved with the image of a phoenix eating its own tail. Inside, a cracked mirror framed in red lacquer, a faded photograph of a woman in a traditional aojai, a severed doll's head still stitched with black thread, a red hair comb, and at the bottom, another tooth, wrapped in silk, with her name embroidered in gold. But it was the mirror that caught her breath. The crack ran straight through the center, from the brow to the chin, splitting the reflection into two. As she looked into it, she didn't see herself. She saw a woman in a wedding dress, face veiled, head tilted slightly too far to the left, not quite smiling, not quite still. Lan blinked. The veil twitched. She slammed the mirror shut and staggered back. Her breath came in short bursts. The attic was silent again, but the air had changed. She could smell burnt silk. She turned. In the far corner of the attic, something moved. She crept closer, hand shaking, and pulled aside a pale blue cloth. Beneath it sat a wedding altar. Old, rotten with time. The paper figurines had yellowed. The candles were stubs fused to the tray. The incense had never been burned. But on the center plate was a caved name into wood. Lei Ti Swoon Mai. The name sent a ripple through her chest. She knew it, not from memory, but from dreams. It was the name whispered behind the veil, the name scratched in her pillow, the name etched in the mirror's breath. She picked up the nameplate. Underneath was another tooth, cracked, blackened, and next to it, tucked inside a crumbling pouch of red silk, was a lock of her mother's hair. Lan dropped the nameplate. The attic exhaled, and the mirror, still wrapped, cracked again, a long, jagged line crawling from the bottom like a vein. She ran. Downstairs, Ba Tom was waiting. She was pouring tea for two, though Lan hadn't told her she was coming. Found it, didn't you? Lan froze in the doorway. Who is Swoon Mai? Ba Tom didn't answer right away. She lifted her cup, sipped, then whispered, My daughter. Lan sat slowly, knees trembling. But I thought you only had one child, my mother. She was my second. Mai was the first, born during the monsoon years. She never made it to her wedding day. Not alive, anyway. Lan's mouth was dry. What happened to her? She was promised to a soldier who died before he could return, but the wedding had been arranged, the gifts already given, so they performed the marriage anyway. Lan's stomach turned. A ghost wedding? Ba Tom nodded. They dressed her, buried her in red, married her to ashes. She placed her cup down, hands trembling, but the spirit didn't take her. The silence that followed was thick as blood. Lan stared. You bound her?" "I tried. She wouldn't go. She stayed behind, attached to her name, her dress, her mirror, her tooth. She became the first." "The first?" Lan whispered. The old woman looked up, and her eyes glistened with something almost like regret. "The first I trapped." The words slammed into her like a wave. Lan stood. No, you're lying!" But her voice cracked. "You trapped your own daughter's ghost?" "I saved her. She was suffering. Her soul was torn, half bride, half orphaned spirit. She had no temple, no shrine, no rest." "So you stuffed her in a jar?" "I gave her a home." The lights flickered, and from the altar room came the unmistakable sound of glass cracking. They both turned. The jar. Lan ran to it. The silk binding was loose again. The lid shivered. Beneath it, teeth clattered like insects. As she reached for it, the mirror in her handbag, taken from the attic, slipped and fell to the floor. It shattered. But the reflection lingered, just for a second. Swoon Mai stared up at her, veil lifted, eyes hollow, a mouth full of bloody teeth, and whispered, "Mother never finished my wedding." That night, Lan locked her door. She burned incense the way her mother once taught her, clockwise, never crossing the smoke. She circled her bed with white chalk. She clutched the silk pouch with her name on it and wept. But still, in the middle of the night, she woke to soft, deliberate tapping. Tap, tap, tap. From inside her pillow. She tore it open, stuffing spilled everywhere, and at the center, buried in white cotton, was a third tooth. Not hers. Too big. Too sharp. Still bloody. Lan didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. She tried. She closed her eyes. She counted her breaths. She recited every childhood prayer she could remember. But every time her eyelids dropped, she saw the mirror, cracked, bleeding, smiling. And when she finally surrendered to exhaustion, she woke with another tooth in her hand. This one was baby-sized, still warm, and wrapped in a silk scrap embroidered with the name Nyak, her mother's name. Lan snapped. She marched into the altar room where Ba Tam sat meditating, incense curling around her like vines. The air was thick with sandalwood and something sharper, clay dust and vinegar. "Tell me the truth," Lan demanded, slamming the tooth down on the altar table. Her grandmother opened her eyes slowly, like someone waking from a centuries-old dream. "You were never supposed to see this. I'm already seeing it. I've seen the dolls, the mirror, the jar. I found my mother's tooth sewn into a bridal pouch. Were you planning to seal me up next?" Silence. Then a whisper. "Yes." The room seemed to collapse in on itself. Lan's breath turned to stone in her throat. "You were born from a bloodline already fractured," Ba Tam said, eyes clouded. "This curse is not new. It began long before me." She walked slowly to the wall behind the altar, sliding aside a wooden panel. Behind it, hidden in shadow, were rows of jars. Not just one, each wrapped in black silk, each sealed with bone-colored wax, each humming quietly. "I kept them all here," Batam whispered, "so the village could keep breathing." Lan shook her head. "You kept what?" "Souls, spirits, brides, children that never cried, wives never buried right. They came to me, or were brought." She stepped back and gestured to the jars. "I offered teeth, thread, nails, bits of shadow sewn into doll skin. I followed the rites." "But something went wrong," Lan said. A pause. Her grandmother nodded once. "Yes." She sat slowly, her bones folding like paper. "It was during the war. We had lost everything. The land was burning. The men were gone. I was pregnant with Mai and starving." She looked up, eyes dull with memory. "There was an old Taoist hermit who lived past the flooded rice fields. He taught me the old rites, the forgotten ones, rites not written down, rites meant to bind the wind itself." Lan stood frozen. "I went to him with an offering, a bowl of salted blood, a lock of hair, and a promise." The silence in the room sharpened. "I promised my firstborn soul, if the spirit of the forest would protect our land." Lan's knees buckled. "You gave her away," she whispered. "I offered her," Batam replied, voice cracking. "But the forest did not accept. The offering was incomplete." "What does that mean?" "I tried to cheat the balance," the old woman said bitterly. "Instead of giving the child alive, I waited until birth. I thought I could trick the spirit." She stared into the altar flame. "Mai was born still." "But her soul didn't pass on." Lan sat on the floor, staring at her own shaking hands. "Is that when it started?" Batam nodded. "The land began to rot. Wells turned red. Cattle were born without tongues, and every 7th year, something worse." She looked toward the sealed jars. "But I couldn't let the spirits go wild, so I bound them, one by one, in dolls, in combs, in teeth." Her voice dropped. "I tried to finish what I started." Lan's voice was cold. "So what am I then? Another offering?" "No," her grandmother whispered. "You are the last thread, the one who still has a name, the one untouched, for now." Lan stood. "I'm not part of this. I won't be. I'll burn every jar in this house before I let you trap me like you trapped her." She turned to leave, but Batam's voice cut the air like a knife. "If you destroy them, they'll come free." Lan paused, and in the air around them, the jars began to hum. Higher, sharper, as if the spirits were listening. She left the house. The wind had changed. The banana leaves were whispering again, except now they whispered names, familiar ones. Hers, her mother's, a third she didn't recognize. Lan walked aimlessly until she reached the edge of the village, the rice paddies. She hadn't stepped into them in years, but today something drew her. At the far end, past the sagging field huts and dried reeds, she saw it. A single grave, unmarked, surrounded by stones arranged in a perfect circle. And tied to one of those stones, a ragged doll, headless, drenched in old blood. Lan approached. The air turned icy. Beneath the doll was a bundle wrapped in banana leaf. Inside, a fingernail, a strand of hair, a piece of pink fabric that smelled like baby powder, and a note, written in old ink, faded but legible. She was never supposed to be born. Lan staggered back. The field swam. That's when she saw the little footprints in the mud, too small to belong to any child alive. They circled the grave, then led toward the trees, vanishing. Back at the house, she didn't speak. She couldn't. The whispers were louder now. The dolls turned when she passed. The ancestral portraits bled from the eyes during dusk. And in the kitchen, she found an old rice jar. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a pacifier. Moldy, stained, chewed clean through. That night she stood at the altar with a lighter in hand, but she couldn't do it. The jars pulsed softly in the dark, like hearts, like lungs, and somewhere among them she heard a voice that was not a whisper, but a cry, soft, newborn, choking on air it never breathed. Lan turned to her grandmother, who now slept in a corner, surrounded by talismans and dried herbs. She looked smaller, frail, hollowed out, but the damage had already been done. Lan knelt before the altar and whispered into the flickering light, "What do you want from me?" And from inside the black silk jar, a tooth rose to the surface, white, sharp, and etched with a name. Her own. Lan didn't touch the tooth. She couldn't. It sat atop the jar like it had floated there, an offering or a warning, still dusted with earth, still warm, still whispering her name in a way only the dead could hear. She stared at it for what felt like hours. It never blinked, it never moved, but it waited, and somehow she knew it didn't belong to the dead. It belonged to her. The next morning, the village was even quieter. If anyone remained, they were hiding. Windows were boarded up, doors covered in soot-black charms. One house had smoke pouring from the roof, but no sound came from within. Lan walked past it like a ghost. She felt untethered. Her feet barely touched the dirt path. She reached a shrine at the center of the village, the place where people once came to light incense for rain, harvests, and safe childbirths. Now it was hollowed out, its altar covered in dried banana leaves and cracked clay figures. A single broken incense stick lay across the offering bowl. But something caught her eye. A bundle of black silk tucked beneath the altar. Her breath caught. She pulled it free. Inside was a tooth, wrapped carefully with red thread and stitched into a square of white gauze. Not just placed, but cradled. A ritual binding. Next to it, a slip of old parchment, almost illegible from time and smoke. Teeth are the nunnery of the spirit. What is not spoken is sealed in enamel. To silence a ghost, you bind its voice. But beware, binding too many will call what was never meant to listen. Lan held the tooth in shaking fingers. It was smaller than the one from the altar, younger, like a child's first molar. She didn't know whose it was, but she knew where it came from. She returned to the house. Ba Tom was asleep in her chair again, head tilted at an unnatural angle, lips parted slightly, as if caught mid-prayer. Lan stepped past her and entered the hidden room behind the altar. This time, she brought a knife. One by one, she began unwrapping the black silk from the jars. There were 12, each sealed with wax and brass thread, each pulsing faintly. She cut the silk from the first. Inside she found a tooth, yellowed and chipped, a nail filing, a strand of red-dyed hair, a small wooden doll, face painted with a grin, but no eyes. The second jar held a baby tooth, a black button, a coin from the French occupation, a strip of bridal fabric with burn marks. The third jar, She stopped. This one was different. The silk had rotted through, the wax seal broken, and inside was nothing. No tooth, no nail, no thread, just dust. And the unmistakable impression in the bottom of the jar, as if something had climbed out. She stood quickly. The air had changed again, and from the far corner of the room, the shadows grew teeth, just for a second. A grin too wide, a whisper too low, a name spoken without lips. Lan. She fled the room, back into the open air, into the dying garden behind the house. Even the banana trees leaned away from her. She dug, with her hands, with the knife, with desperation, because deep down she knew the tooth on the altar had not floated up by chance. She was being chosen, marked. Beneath the soil she found it, another jar, not like the others. This one was new, unsealed. Inside was a folded cloth, blood-stained, holding a tooth, her own. She remembered losing it years ago after a fall on the school steps in Hanoi. Her mother had wrapped it in tissue, said they'd bury it in the garden for good luck, but they never did, because it had never been hers to keep. It had been sent here, to this house, to this curse, to this altar. Batam had kept it, stored it, prayed over it, and now she was using it. Lan returned to the house and confronted her. Her grandmother looked up as if she'd been expecting her all along. "You've been saving my teeth since I was a child." "Yes," Batam replied simply. "Why?" Her voice was gentle, not cruel, not mad, just tired. "To keep you safe." Lan slammed the jar down. "You call this safe? No spirit can take what's already bound. You were born under a broken moon. Your soul was already split. I had to hold the pieces together." "With jars?" Lan hissed. "With silk and silence, with things they can't scream through." Her hand trembled as she reached for a pouch near the altar. Inside were more of Lan's things, baby hair, broken nail clippings, even a photo with the eyes scratched out. Lan stared at it in horror. "This is witchcraft." "No," Batam said softly. "This is desperation." Lan backed away. "You're insane." "I'm old," her grandmother corrected. "There's a difference. Insane people forget. I remember everything." Then she looked up, and for the first time Lan saw something break in her face, something unguarded. "I watched my daughter die inside her own wedding veil. I heard the crying from the floorboards when I failed to finish the rites. I've kept them all here, Lan, not to trap them, but to keep them from spilling." She reached for the cracked mirror on the table. "It's leaking now. The veil is thin. They're clawing through." "Then let them go," Lan whispered. "I can't." The old woman closed her eyes. That night the wind carried chanting, low, rhythmic, feminine, not from a single voice, but dozens. It came from the trees, from the attic, from beneath the floor. Lan tried to block it out. She stuffed cloth into her ears, covered her head with a blanket. But the sound found her, and beneath her pillow, once again, a tooth. Only this time, it had bite marks in it, as if someone had tried to chew their way out. She rose, lit a candle, and walked barefoot into the altar room. The jars were rattling now, not whispering, not humming, rattling. Something wanted out, something almost free, and in the middle of them all sat her own jar, her own name, her own thread, unsealed, untouched. She picked it up, held it close to her ear. No sound, no voice, just a single exhale. And then, finish it.
Lan had not spoken in hours. She sat at the edge of her bed, the jar with her name resting in her lap, as if it might begin breathing. It didn't. But something else did. The house. It inhaled through the cracked wood and exhaled through the silken altar veils. It sighed when she moved. It groaned when she stood still. And somewhere between those walls, behind the ancestral portraits and beneath the dusty prayer scrolls, something was whispering again. But this time, it wasn't in her ears. It was in her mouth. She bit down instinctively and tasted iron. Blood. Her gums throbbed. Her teeth ached. She staggered to the bathroom and leaned over the ceramic sink. Her reflection stared back, pale, sunken, with eyes that looked a little too much like Ba Tum's. She opened her mouth. Everything looked normal, until she ran her tongue along her back molars and felt something strange. A gap. One tooth was missing. She hadn't noticed before. And now, in its place, there was something soft. Not flesh, not rot. Something stitched. She reached in, trembling. Her fingers brushed thread, black, rough, pulled tight. She screamed. The next thing she knew, she was on the floor, shaking, crying. The mirror above the sink had cracked again, just slightly, right down the middle. And behind her reflection, in that thin sliver of glass, stood a figure in red, veiled, head bowed, mouth sewn shut. Len blinked. It vanished. She didn't tell Ba Tum. She didn't need to. When she returned to the main room, her grandmother was already setting out tools, silver needles, ash bowls, crimson thread spools stained with something old. "What is this?" Len asked hoarsely. "The rite of containment," the old woman said. "You're slipping. The seal is failing. The spirits are beginning to enter through your mouth." Len stared. She wanted to run, to scream, but she couldn't even form the words. Her lips trembled, her jaw clicked involuntarily, and somewhere deep inside her, she heard laughter. A child's laugh, high and hollow. Then a second voice, raspy and dry, like leaves dragged across bone. "She was promised. Give her back." Len dropped to her knees. The voices were inside her now, not beside her, not behind her, inside. That night she tried everything. Salt circles, chalk symbols, burnt sage. None of it worked. At midnight, her pillow turned damp. She pulled back the covers. A trail of baby teeth had spilled across the sheet, each one nestled inside a smear of black-red spit. She gagged. One tooth had been chewed into the shape of a tiny doll. She kicked the pillow across the room. It hit the wall, split open, and from inside spilled wedding pins, doll hair, and a scrap of burned silk with the words, "To bind her voice, stitch her tongue." Lan was unraveling. Her thoughts felt jagged, sharp around the edges. She went 3 days without speaking. Each time she opened her mouth, she heard something else breathe in through her. And always, just before dawn, another tooth appeared. She kept them in a bowl by the door. By the 4th day, the bowl was full. She confronted Ba Tum again.
You lied to me." The old woman was preparing rice porridge, her movements methodical, practiced, exhausted. "I told you what you were ready to hear." Len slammed her hand on the table. "I said you were the last thread. I said you were keeping me safe, but I'm being hollowed out." Batam didn't look up. "Safety is not the same as survival." Len stepped closer. "What does that mean?" "It means," her grandmother whispered, "that the spirits don't just want your name, or your tooth, or your shadow." She finally looked up. "They want your voice." Len backed away. Her hand flew to her throat. "They want to speak through me?" Batam nodded, slowly. "One voice, one vessel, that's all they need." "But why me?" "Because you're still whole, still living, and you have their memories stitched into you." Len shook her head violently. "I didn't ask for this." "No," Batam agreed. "Neither did your mother, or her mother before her." Then she reached into a tin box beneath the altar. Inside was an old cassette tape wrapped in red gauze. She placed it gently on the table. "Listen," she said. Len hesitated, then pressed play. At first, nothing but static. Then, a voice, familiar, young, breathless. Her mother's. "If you find this, Lan, I'm sorry. I should have left. I should have taken you far from here, but I couldn't. I started hearing her again. She kept saying my name, in the mirror, in the rice water, in my mouth." The tape hissed, cracked, click, silence. Lan sat back, tears streaming silently down her face. "I was born into a curse." "Yes," Batam said, "but you might be the only one who can end it." Len looked up, hollow-eyed. "How?" Her grandmother slowly lifted the brass needle. "We sew the voice shut." "I'm not putting that in me." "I have to," Batam said gently. "Just one stitch in the shadow, beneath the tongue. It will hold them back until we're ready for the final offering." "Ready for what?" The old woman didn't answer. Instead, she held out a mirror. Len looked, and for the first time, she saw her reflection smile. But she hadn't. Her lips were still, her face unmoving, but the reflection grinned, wide and toothless. She screamed. The mirror shattered, and all around her the walls began to bleed from the nail holes. That night, she agreed. Batam boiled the thread in rainwater and crushed poppy seeds. She asked Len to bite on a cinnamon stick. She dipped the brass needle in ink made from soot and egg yolk, and she whispered a prayer older than the village itself. "Mouth of bone, tongue of clay, seal what wishes not to stay. Voice of child, soul of bride, sleep in silence, bound inside." Len gritted her teeth and let her grandmother sew one single stitch into the shadow beneath her tongue. She passed out before the knot was tied. She woke the next morning with a blood taste in her mouth, but the voices were gone, for now, and beside her pillow was a jar, unmarked, empty, waiting.
The stitch held. Lan didn't hear the voices that morning, not in the walls, not in the mirror, not in her mouth. The world was quieter, but not empty. It was the silence of something holding its breath, like the forest before a storm, like a bride waiting at the altar, veil trembling, feet never touching the ground. Lan walked through the village just after dawn. The mist clung lower today,
like a burial shroud thrown across the trees. The path felt softer, less real. Even the banana leaves looked waxen, preserved too long. She needed answers, not from Batam, not from the jars, but from someone who had seen it all and survived, if there was anyone left. She found him near the ruined pagoda, an old man hunched over a rusted incense burner, placing thin sticks into the ash as if offering apologies to things he could no longer name. She remembered him faintly, Ondat, a childhood neighbor who used to feed her sweet corn and tell stories he wasn't supposed to tell. He was one of the last elders, and he was still breathing. Lan approached slowly. "Ong?" He didn't turn. "Ongdat, do you remember Sun Mai?" The incense snapped. A tiny spark flared, then vanished. He froze. And then he turned his head slowly. His mouth did not open, but he raised one hand, weathered, veined, trembling, and traced 3 lines in the air. A circle, a cross, and then a line through both. Lan frowned. "I don't understand." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper, burned around the edges. He pressed it into her palm. Then he closed his eyes and did not open them again. The paper held a name, Le Ti Sun Mai, and beneath it a symbol, an old one, not Buddhist, not Taoist, older. It looked like a doorway, split down the middle, with teeth. Lan walked home in a daze. As she passed the homes, she noticed something she hadn't before. Each had a doll nailed above the doorframe, some headless, some eyeless, some mouthless, all with red thread stitched shut their faces. She stopped at one and looked closer. The doll had a name stitched into its chest. Mai. Another. Mai. And another. All of them. Mai. Batam was waiting at the gate. "You went to see Dot," she said, as if it were obvious. Lan held up the paper. "Why does every house have her name sewn into the dolls?" The old woman's face turned to stone. "Because she was the last bride this village ever buried." Lan stepped forward. "You mean the last ghost bride?" "Yes." "And she wasn't laid to rest properly, was she?" "No," Batam whispered. "She refused the spirit meant to marry her." Lan blinked. "She chose not to go?" She stayed," Batam said. "She wanted something else, or maybe she just wanted to be known." A pause. "She had your mother's eyes." They sat together that evening. No food, just tea that tasted like dried lotus and old regret. Lan asked the question carefully. "Was Sun Mai in love before the war?" Her grandmother said nothing for a long while. Then finally she said, "She loved a girl." Lan looked up. "She loved her with a quiet fire. They used to sit beneath the banana trees and tie red thread around their fingers, promising to never marry anyone else." "But she was betrothed to a man?" "A soldier. One of her cousins arranged it, said it was the only way to protect the family name." Lan felt her throat tighten. "And then he died?" before the wedding could be completed, before his name was even written in the house records, but the dowry had already been accepted. So they held the wedding anyway. Lan's voice shook. With his ashes? Batam nodded. And her body. The wind rose outside, long fingers scraping the shutters. Lan whispered, and then everything changed? No, Batam said. Everything continued. That was the problem. She looked Lan in the eyes. We should have buried her as she wished. We should have given her a name stone beside the one she loved. But instead, we tried to bind her, trap her, fix her into our stories. Her voice cracked, and she never forgave us. Lan stood. Take me to her. Her grandmother looked afraid, not of the dead, of the truth. They walked at dusk, beyond the old orchard, through the fog-choked trees, into the forest's edge where the land had collapsed into itself years ago, forming a shallow depression no one dared fill. There was a grave marker, uncarved, just a stone slab, and behind it, a bridal altar, blackened, half-buried, rotting, but still there, still waiting. Lan knelt before it. She lit a stick of incense, not from the house, from her coat pocket, one her mother had tucked there the last time she had visited this place. She lit it with shaking hands and whispered, "I'm sorry." The wind didn't move, but the smoke curled upward into a shape, a veil, a face, a mouth stitched shut, a voice trembling against the bonds. I only wanted to be known. Lan touched the soil. It was soft. Beneath her fingers she felt silk, wrapped around bone and tied with thread. She pulled gently. Up came a tooth, wrapped in red, cracked but still whole, and embroidered on the silk, bride of no one. That night the house was silent. Even the jars did not hum. Lan placed the tooth beside the cracked mirror, and the reflection no longer smiled. It only watched, waiting, listening. And as she closed her eyes, she dreamed of a wedding that never was held, of a bride who walked herself to her grave, of a mouthful of shadows finally willing to speak.
Lan awoke before dawn, her body cold, her hands clenched around something she didn't remember holding. She opened her palm slowly. Red thread, tangled, knotted, fraying at the ends. She stared at it, her breath catching. It wasn't just thread, it was a binding string, the same kind the ghost brides had worn, the same kind used in the altar jars, the same kind that marked the dolls nailed above every door in the village. But this piece was torn, and it had 3 knots, one for a promise, one for a name, one for a betrayal. She found Ba Tum awake already. The old woman sat by the ancestral altar, unspooling another length of crimson thread between her fingers, murmuring something so softly it sounded like breath itself. Lan stood in the doorway and said, "You've been hiding things from me." Ba Tum didn't turn around. "I've been protecting you." "No," Lan said, "you've been choosing who gets bound and who gets buried." The thread stopped moving. A long pause. Then slowly, Ba Tum turned. "I did what I had to survive, to protect the village, the lineage."
Lon stepped forward, holding up the torn thread. 3 knots. Who were they for? The old woman stared at it with something like fear, and then she whispered, "Me, your mother, you." Lon sat. She didn't want to, but she had to hear it now. All of it. Start from the beginning. Batam nodded slowly, like a tree remembering its first winter. When Mai died, the village blamed me, said I had summoned something unnatural, said I had broken the pact. Lon narrowed her eyes. What pact? The one our ancestors made with the forest. The air grew still. We were allowed to settle here, Batam said. Allowed to build, to plant, to raise children, but only if we honored the dead properly, with clean rites, with silence, with obedience. She looked at Lon. And I broke that. I tried to change the rules. I offered what should not have been offered. Your daughter, Lon whispered. My blood, Batam said, voice raw. And the forest knew it. The first knot, she said, was tied on the night she sewed Mai's name into a bridal doll, without permission. She had meant it as comfort, but in doing so, she bound Mai's spirit to the village. Not the earth, not the gods, the village. And the village was rotting. The second knot came years later, after Ngak, Lon's mother, was born, and began to see things, hear things, speak in languages she had never been taught. She was gifted, Batam said softly, touched by spirits, by bloodlines. I thought I could anchor her. You bound her too, Lon said, didn't you? Her grandmother nodded. I made a doll, just like Mai's. I placed her tooth in it, sewed it with this thread, promised it would protect her. Lon slowed. What happened? She bled from the mouth for 3 days, Batam said, voice cracking. The spirits didn't want her protected. They wanted her used. Lon stood. And the third knot? Silence. Lon walked to the altar and picked up one of the jars. It rattled faintly, as if the teeth inside remembered what it felt like to be whole. Whose spirit is in here? Batam didn't answer, so Lon opened it. Inside, not just a tooth, a photograph, faded, burned at the edges, a woman standing in front of the forest holding a baby wrapped in red cloth. Her mother. And Lon. Her throat tightened. She looked at her grandmother. You bound me before I could even speak. Yes, because I saw what was coming. Lon's voice shook. You turned me into a vessel. No, her grandmother whispered. I turned you into a lock. Lon dropped the jar. It didn't break, but the whispering inside grew louder. The names, the pleas, the curses, the teeth, all clicking now, rattling in harmony. She stormed out of the house, into the forest, back to the unmarked grave, back to the altar of the lost bride. She knelt and pulled out the red thread from her pocket, the torn one, and she tried to undo the knots. But the thread fought her. Each loop cinched tighter the harder she pulled, as if the spirits had tied it from the inside out. Her fingers bled. Still she pulled, still it held, until, finally, snap, the last knot tore free, and the forest exhaled. She didn't realize the wind had died until it returned, a violent gust, blowing ash from the altar, knocking the incense bowl into the dirt, and rising from beneath the soil, a shadow. It had no face, only a veil. It had no voice, only the sound of cracking teeth and torn thread. Lon stared at it, her hands open. She whispered, Shun Mai? The veil turned toward her and slowly, deliberately, nodded, then pointed past the trees, past the house, toward the hill where the village used to burn its paper offerings. Lon understood. She ran, through the dying trees, past the ghost dolls, up the ash hill. There, buried beneath layers of soot and bone-charred wood, was an old stone box. She dug with her hands, her nails split, but she found it. She pulled it free. Inside, a wedding sash, red silk, unworn, unsigned, and wrapped inside it, a comb, snapped in half, with blood still dried on the teeth. She took it in her hands and said, "I'm sorry. We should have listened to you. We should have buried you with her." Behind her, the wind fell silent again, and for just 1 second, she felt a hand on her shoulder, cool, light, forgiving. When Lon returned to the house, Ba Tom was gone. No signs of struggle, no notes, no blood. Just her chair, still warm, and a length of red thread, untied, resting on the altar. Lon didn't cry, not yet. She took the thread and stitched it through the comb, then placed it into the last jar, the one with her name. She sealed it with wax and whispered, "You are known now. You are free, and I am no longer yours to carry." The jar didn't rattle that night. It simply settled, as if the spirit inside had accepted something it had waited lifetimes to hear. And for the first time since returning to the village, Lon dreamed of nothing. No mirrors, no voices, no teeth. Just a black sea, still as breath, with no wind and no bottom. And in the middle of it, silence. She woke at dawn. The house was quiet. The floors no longer creaked. The shadows didn't shift in corners. Even the ancestral portraits on the walls seemed less heavy, less watchful. But something still felt wrong. Not inside the house, outside it. She stepped into the courtyard barefoot. The mist was back, thicker than ever, wrapped around the village like gauze soaked in something old. It clung to the trees, to the wells, to the dolls nailed above the door frames. The birds weren't singing, and the banana leaves were hanging limp as if mourning. Lon walked to the edge of the garden and noticed it. Instantly. The well was weeping. Not water, blood. A thin, dark stream trickled down the stone lip and into the cracked earth below. Just like the stories, just like her mother used to whisper. Every 7th year, the well runs red, and something must be buried in it, or something will crawl out. Lon felt her chest tighten. This year, this lunar cycle, was the 7th, and the offering had not been made. She ran to the temple ruins at the heart of the village, where elders once kept the old calendars carved into bamboo boards. She searched the broken walls, found the prayer slab beneath an overturned gong drum. The carvings were faded, but the symbols were still there. 7 flames, 7 mouths, 7 jars. And then, a cracked symbol smeared with what looked like soot or old blood. If the offering is lost, the mouths will open. Lon returned to the house, and for the first time she opened the storage room behind the altar completely. The jars were still there, but something had changed. The lids had all cracked, each one split clean down the middle. The silk wrappings were gone, and beside each jar was a small pile of salt, burned black. She counted them. 12. Then a 13th jar she didn't recognize. It was warm to the touch. And inside, not a tooth, but a stone, smooth, round, blood red, pulsing. She went to the elder's house, found the old scribe's books buried beneath rotting floorboards and ash. She flipped through the pages until she found it. The curse of the 7th year. When the land forgets its dead, the mouths will return, not to speak, but to eat. If the offering is rejected or incomplete, the land will rot from its belly, the blood will rise, and no woman shall bear a voice again. Long's hands trembled. That was what had been happening all along. The babies with no mouths, the dolls with stitched lips, the villagers who no longer spoke. It wasn't silence. It was debt. Unpaid. Unforgiven. Unburied. Lon returned to the well. The blood was deeper now. Not a trickle, a rise. The rope that once held the bucket was soaked red, the stone lip cracked like broken teeth. She knew what had to be done, but she didn't know how. She sat at her mother's shrine that night, lighting the last stick of ancestral incense. She placed the blood-red stone in a bowl beside it and whispered, "Tell me what I need to give them." And the flame flickered sideways. The air thickened, and from behind her, a cold voice, not her mother's, but something older, answered. "Your voice is sealed, but your name is not." Lon rose and walked to the altar where her name had once been embroidered into the silk of a spirit jar. She unwrapped the silk now, threadbare and unraveling. She cut the embroidery free. She burned it in the brass offering bowl. And as the ashes curled upward, she felt the ground beneath her hum. Midnight, she returned to the well, and in her hand she carried the comb of Swun Mai, the last token, the final offering. She tied it with fresh red thread and whispered into the mouth of the well, "This is what was owed. This is what was taken. This is what must rest." She dropped it in. It sank without a sound. The blood stopped rising. The air turned still. And from deep below came a single exhale. Not angry, not mournful, just tired. And Lon collapsed beside the well and stared up at the sky. The stars looked different, softer, further away. The wind moved through the trees again. The banana leaves fluttered like old fans, and in the distance, somewhere deep in the forest, a baby cried. For the first time in 7 years. The next morning she walked through the village. The dolls above the doors were gone. The thread bindings had unraveled. The well was clear. The wind was singing again, and the walls no longer bled. But in her grandmother's chair sat a folded scrap of paper, old, creased, with a single sentence written in brushstroke ink. "The forest does not forget, but it forgives when spoken to gently." Lon folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. She looked at the house one last time, and then she left the village behind. But the red thread still wrapped around her wrist, just loosely now. No knots, no bindings, only a reminder. Lan walked into the forest as the sun fell behind the hills, not because she had to, because she couldn't leave yet. Not truly. The curse might have lifted from the village, the well might have run clear, but the forest still watched. Its trees leaned too closely together. The wind moved like it was pulling something behind it, and somewhere deep among those roots, the dead still whispered. She followed the old path, not the one trodden by the living, but the ritual path, marked by hanging talismans now bleached by rain and years. They fluttered gently above her, like fading prayers, each one stained with old blood and binding ink. The deeper she went, the colder it became. The leaves turned from gray to gray, the ground from soil to clay, and eventually she reached a place no one spoke of, Dum Im Long, the still hollow, where the forest was softest, where nothing grew, where even birds forgot how to sing. There, in a shallow depression surrounded by banana trees with trunks like twisted spines, she found them. Dolls. Dozens. No. Hundreds. Buried halfway into the earth. All made of forest clay, the same red-brown earth once used to build ancestral urns, fertility idols, and war offerings. Their limbs were cracked, their heads tilted. Some had hair, some had beads for eyes, but none had mouths. And each one had a tiny heart shaped from hardened ash pressed into their chest. Lan knelt. She picked one up. It crumbled in her hands, and inside was a single baby tooth, still sharp, still white. She stared at the field of dolls. Who had placed them here? Her grandmother? The villagers? Or someone else? Lan took out her pocket knife and began to dig. One doll, then another. She pulled out their hearts. Each one held something: a shard of mirror, a lock of hair, a fingernail, a tooth, a drop of dried blood, a name carved into brittle clay. None of them had been named aloud. None of them had been mourned. That was the secret. That was the reason they stayed. They were forgotten bindings, burials in silence, and silence over time became hunger. She sat in the center of the field, the dolls surrounding her like mourners, and she spoke, not loudly, but clearly. I see you. The leaves rustled. I remember you. The dolls trembled. I give you names. She named every one of them. Not the names from the village registers, names from her dreams, names whispered in her sleep, names that came to her when she stared too long into the mirror's crack. As she spoke, the dolls began to crumble, one by one, softly like dust returning to dust. The forest did not roar, it did not scream, it breathed, in, out, and for a moment, it sounded like relief. Lan found the last doll at the base of a twisted banyan tree, larger than the others, wrapped in faded bridal cloth. Its heart was different, heavier, darker, not made from ash, but charcoal and bone. Inside was not a tooth, but a voice. When she broke it open, she heard her mother sing, only for a moment, only one note, but it was enough. She dug a pit with her hands, her nails cracked. She buried the last of the dolls beneath the banyan, wrapped them in silk, poured water from her flask over the roots, and whispered, "I bind no more. I bury what was bound. I return silence to soil, not as punishment, but as peace." The wind turned warm. The trees stopped leaning. The dolls were still. And then, gone. Lan left the forest before nightfall, but it followed her gently, no longer as a threat, but as something grateful. A memory softened, a wound scabbed over. When she reached the edge of the trees, she found a bundle waiting for her on the stone marker, a spool of unused red thread, a pair of silver scissors, and a folded note in her grandmother's handwriting. "When the time comes, use the scissors, not the thread. You are not a weaver, you are a cutter of cords." She stood beneath the falling light and understood. The curse had never been about binding alone. It had been about refusing to let go. And now, she could. Lan returned to the house long after the sun had disappeared. Her shoes were heavy with clay. Her hands still bore the imprint of buried dolls and broken hearts, but her soul felt lighter. The curse had begun to dissolve. The forest no longer watched her like prey. The village no longer whispered through rotting teeth. And yet, that night, when she lay down to sleep, something returned. Not a voice, not a shadow, but a weight. Soft at first, then undeniable, like something had curled up beside her in bed. She sat up. The air was still. The room was dark, lit only by a low-burning oil lamp near the ancestral shelf. She turned her head slowly. The pillow beside her, empty when she had closed her eyes, was now full, too full. She reached out, heart pounding. Her hand sank into it, too easily. The stuffing had changed. She pulled the pillow toward her. It was lumpy, wet. She tore it open, and dozens of teeth spilled out. Baby teeth, adult teeth, blackened molars, cracked incisors, one still streaked with blood. They rolled across the floor like seeds from a broken fruit. At the center of them all, one gold tooth, old, dull, etched with a name on the root. Mai. Lan didn't scream. She couldn't. Something had returned, something that was not grateful, something that had never been buried. She took the gold tooth to the altar, lit 3 sticks of incense. The air refused to move. She pressed her fingers around the tooth, whispering, "You were laid to rest. Why are you still here?" No reply, only silence, and then a soft creaking from above. The attic. She climbed the ladder with numb hands. The trapdoor groaned open, and the moment her head rose above the floorboards, she smelled it. Rotting silk, burned hair, dried milk. She pulled herself up, and there, sitting in the middle of the attic floor, was her childhood pillow, the one her mother had sewn. It was open at the seams, and inside, more teeth. But these were different. Each one had been engraved with dates. Lan picked one up. July 12th, her 7th birthday. Another, October 3rd, the night her mother fell ill. Another, March 29th, the day she left for university. Each tooth was a memory, stolen, filed, stored, and now returned. She turned and saw something she hadn't noticed before. A mirror, tall, old, cracked clean down the center. It had been covered by a funeral cloth, but now the cloth had slipped just enough for her to see half her reflection. But the other half wasn't hers. It was a woman in a red bridal dress, smiling, not with lips, with teeth. Rows and rows of teeth, not in her mouth, but sewn across her veil, stitched like a warning. Her eyes locked with Lan's, and she whispered, though no mouth moved, "You buried the dolls, but not me." Lan backed away. The mirror rippled. A tooth struck the floor behind her, then another, then a third. They came from the rafters, raining down from above like hailstones. The attic trembled, and then she heard it. From inside the pillow, from inside the mirror, from inside her. Click, 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 click. The sound of teeth. Too many, too close, too angry. She ran downstairs. The house groaned beneath her feet. The mirrors cracked as she passed. The jars on the altar began to hum again. Jars she had thought empty. Jars she had buried. Jars she had forgotten. She opened one. Inside, not a tooth, not a doll, but a shard of her own baby bracelet, soaked in something black. Another jar. Inside, her mother's earrings. Another, a lock of her own hair, tied in red string, still damp. They weren't just vessels, they were anchors for the ones who didn't want to leave. She stood in the altar room, surrounded by open jars, teeth on the floor, mirrors weeping, shadows inching closer, and she realized the truth. Not all spirits want peace. Some want to stay, not for love, but for vengeance. And some want to wear your body like a dress. She grabbed the scissors her grandmother had left her, silver, sharp. She ran to the sewing room where old ritual dolls were once made. She found the final doll, hidden in a drawer, wrapped in lace. It was newer than the others. Its chest was stitched with gold thread. Its face looked like her own. She picked up the scissors, cut the thread across its lips, and for the first time, the doll breathed. Its chest rose, its mouth opened, and it whispered, in her grandmother's voice, "She never left, Lan. She's still inside you." The lamp flickered, and Lan saw her reflection again in the window. Her mouth, no longer closed, but slightly open, and from the shadows behind her teeth, a second row.
Lan didn't sleep. She couldn't. Not with the teeth clicking in the walls. Not with the mirrors bleeding at the edges. Not with her own reflection whispering things she hadn't said. She stood at the altar before dawn, arms shaking, scissors still in her hand. The doll she'd unstitched now lay limp on the table, its mouth wide open, its button eyes rolled upward, as if it had finally said everything it had held inside. Lan didn't know what had been released, but she knew it wasn't done. She lit 3 sticks of incense, then a 4th, then a 5th. The smoke didn't rise.
It curled down, toward the jars, as if pulled, as if fed. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" And the air answered, not in words, but with a breath, a single inhale taken from every corner of the house, as though something was preparing to speak, using her lungs. That's when she knew. The rituals hadn't failed. They had worked too well. And now the bindings were unraveling, not just from the dolls and the jars, but from her own body. She had been made into a vessel, not for one ghost, but for all of them. A final offering, the last bride. She stumbled into the sewing room, pulled down her grandmother's scrolls scattered across the walls and drawers. Most were written in ink too faded to read, but one still held its red markings etched into dried bamboo. Ritual of reversal. Used only when the vessel is unwilling, only when the gate opens from both sides, only when the name begins to split the tongue. It was possible. There was a way back, but it came at a cost. The ritual called for 7 ingredients: a mirror broken by the possessed, a tooth still warm from the jaw, a thread unraveled from the soul doll, a drop of blood willingly offered, the name of the first ghost bride, the last spoken word of the vessel's mother, a knife that has never drawn anger. Each item had to be prepared at the hour of crossing, when night and dawn hold equal sway, when no shadow has an owner. Lan had hours, maybe less. She began gathering. The broken mirror was easy. Her reflection had already seen to that. The warm tooth was harder, but she remembered the one that had fallen from her pillow, the one with the root still red. She placed both into a bowl wrapped in her mother's shawl. Then she pulled the thread from the doll she had unstitched the night before, the one with her face. She added it to the bundle. 3 items down, 4 to go. For the drop of blood, she used her grandmother's brass needle. Pricked her thumb, let it fall onto the thread. It sizzled. The ritual had begun. Next, the name of the first ghost bride. She hesitated, then whispered, "Sun Mai." The smoke from the incense flared sideways. One of the jars tipped over. Something inside it hissed. 6th, the last spoken word of her mother. That took longer. But Lan remembered. That day in the city hospital, when her mother had been fading, her body emptying faster than machines could measure. Lan had asked her, "What should I do with all this pain?" And her mother had smiled, just faintly, and said, "Plant it." She etched the word into the bamboo with her own blood. Plant it. Finally, the knife. She didn't own many, but in the drawer near the altar, behind folded red cloth, she found one wrapped in blue silk. It was small, ritual-sized. Its blade was still clean, untouched by meat or vengeance. It had only ever been used to carve words. It would do. She prepared the space in the courtyard, drawn with ash, circled with rice flour and cut threads. 7 stones placed around her, 7 mirrors facing inward, 7 offerings placed in a clay bowl cracked at the rim. She sat in the center and held her name in her mouth like a fragile tooth. Then she whispered the invocation. What was sealed is unsewn. What was named is now returned. I am not your vessel. I am not your bride. The wind stopped. The rice paper on the shrine burst into flame, and from the forest something began to walk. Not a ghost, not a person. Something stitched together. From veils, from bone, from names spoken too many times in fear. It had her mother's shadow, her grandmother's breath, her own eyes, but the mouths, there were many, lined across its chest, its arms, its neck. Every tooth she had ever found, every name she had never spoken, They opened, and from them came a voice layered on top of itself. You are the house. You are the altar. You are the pillow, the jar, the bride, the child. You are not one. You are all. Lan stood, heart pounding. I am not yours. She raised the knife, cut the thread from her wrist. It screamed. The dolls in the attic ignited. The altar cracked. The jars burst open one by one, sending up flares of light and ash and teeth into the night sky. And then, silence. Not empty. Clean. Lan stood alone in the ash ring. All the mirrors had shattered inward. The bowl had burned to dust. The knife was gone. But her hands, they were her own again. No trembling, no blood, no thread. She looked up. The moon had returned, and in the trees, for the first time in years, nothing watched her. The moon rose red, not warm, not gentle, but raw, like a wound. It hovered above the village, swollen and low, casting long streaks of bloodlight across the banana trees that lined the old path. Their leaves rustled like teeth gnashing in prayer, their trunks glistening as if sweating through bark. Lan stood in the courtyard, barefoot, staring up at it. The ritual was done. The bindings were broken. But the sky had not returned to silence, and neither had the dead. Behind her, the house began to groan. Not creak, groan. The sound of old wood remembering what had been buried beneath it. The walls pulsed, the roof sighed, and from beneath the floorboards she heard it again. Click, then click, click, then a chorus. Teeth. All of them awake. Lan turned toward the altar room. The door had opened on its own. Inside, candles burned, though none had been lit, and the jars, the ones she thought had shattered, were whole again, lined up neatly. But they weren't silent. They whispered now, not in curses, not in rage, in mourning. Each jar hummed a different name. Each jar trembled with grief. Each jar bled wax from the top that turned to ash before it touched the floor. They weren't holding spirits anymore. They were holding regret. In the center of the room stood something new, a wedding altar, built from fragments of the old ones she had burned. Atop it, a mirror, cracked, of course, and leaning against it, a doll, hand-sewn, its mouth not sewn shut, but wide open. And in that mouth, a ring, gold, worn smooth by time. She picked it up. Inside was an engraving, "Until the veil parts." She staggered back. "No," she whispered. But the room darkened, the candles folded inward, and in the mirror, Swan Mai returned. No veil this time, no stitched lips, only eyes, black and full of drowning light. Her skin was no longer rotting. It was pale, soft. Her mouth opened slowly, and her voice was calm. "You ended the ritual, but you did not release the vow." Lan shook her head. "No, I gave back everything. I buried the dolls, I burned the names." Swan Mai tilted her head. "The forest forgives, but I remember. You carry my bloodline. You walk in my thread. You are the daughter of the silence I was denied. Lan backed away. Swan Mai stepped out of the mirror, not as smoke, not as shadow, but as flesh. The room pulsed. The air grew thick with the scent of river mud and wet silk. Lan ran, out into the night. The moon glared above her. The banana trees leaned toward her like mourners, and from the sky a fine mist began to fall. But it wasn't water. It was ash, ash that tasted like bone. She reached the center of the village. There, the well glowed, not red this time, but white, like moonlight trapped underground. And beside it stood all the old women who had once sewn the dolls, the ones who had vanished, the ones with eyes sewn shut, mouths filled with thread. Now they watched her, eyes open, but mouths gone, erased. One by one, they turned toward the forest, and behind them a figure emerged, Batam, wearing her funeral robe, eyes bright, alive. She looked at Lan, and her voice echoed, not aloud, but in every jar still hidden in the house. This is the price. The last vow must be fulfilled. You must choose. Swan Mai appeared beside her, veil trailing behind her like river fog. One bride must remain, one thread must hold. Lan's voice cracked. No, I won't replace you. Swan Mai stepped forward. Then everything we buried returns. The trees shook, the ground opened, the dolls rose, not from clay, but from flesh now, wearing skin, wearing names. The village began to rot in reverse, roofs collapsed backward, the air filled with the cries of infants born without mouths. The well bled again, the moon screamed. Lan dropped to her knees. I didn't want any of this. Swan Mai touched her cheek, and for the first time, she smiled, truly smiled. Neither did I. Lan reached for her wrist, the red thread, still there, still unknotted. She looked at Swan Mai, at her grandmother, at the hollow women, and slowly she tied a single knot. Only one, not to bind, but to remember. The moon dimmed, the well cleared, the dolls crumbled to dust. Swan Mai faded, not in anger, not in sorrow, but in peace. And as she vanished, she whispered, "Tell our story, not our silence."
The dawn came without ceremony. No fanfare, no bird song, just light, thin and gray, spilling over the rooftops of a village that no longer whispered. Lan stood in the courtyard, barefoot, her hands streaked with clay and thread, ash beneath her fingernails. The red string on her wrist fluttered faintly in the breeze. One knot, no more. She had not slept, but she was no longer tired. The altar inside the house was still intact, though the jars were empty now. Dust filled them, or memory, or maybe something smaller and quieter than either. The portraits on the wall had faded overnight, the faces softened, the eyes closed. And on the mat where Batum once prayed each morning was a bundle wrapped in black silk. Lan unwrapped it with steady hands. Inside, a comb
carved from river bone, a brass needle, clean and sharp, a pouch of dried herbs, and a single tooth, small and yellowed, with a hairline crack down the center. Tied around the tooth was a ribbon, white, and stitched into the fabric in red thread. "The last one is yours." Lan didn't cry. She sat on the mat, laid the items before her, and folded her hands. The house breathed gently around her, like it was settling into sleep. She whispered, "You were the one who bore it all. The silence, the screams, the bargains. You sewed the mouths shut so we could speak again. You did what you could." She lit a stick of incense and placed the tooth into the last jar, the 13th, then sealed it with wax made from the leftover altar candles. It did not rattle, it did not hum, it simply sat, still. Lan buried the jar beneath the banana tree behind the house, the same one where she'd once lost her first tooth, the same one where her mother had buried a doll made from her baby hair. She dug carefully, not as ritual, not as defense, as remembrance. When the soil covered the lid, she sat beside it, watched the wind move through the leaves, and for the first time in her life, she felt safe. She stayed in the village for 3 more days. She cleaned the rooms, swept the shrine, burned the dolls that remained in the attic, placing coins beside each flame. She found the children's toys buried beneath the floorboards, little shoes, silver bracelets, broken teacups, and she wrapped them in cloth and returned them to the forest, not as offerings, as apologies. On the 4th day, she packed her bag, just clothes, a photo of her mother, a slip of bamboo with her grandmother's last handwriting, and 1 spool of red thread. Still whole, still unused, she tied it to her wrist, but this time, no knot. She left the village by foot. The road felt different now, less narrow, less forgotten. The banana trees bowed as she passed. The wind was warm, not watching. And when she reached the stone marker at the edge of Junyen, she stopped, ran her fingers along the moss-covered letters. Most were gone now, but one remained, the very last character in the name. Yen, swallow, a bird that migrates, but always finds its way back. Lan smiled. As she walked down the road, she passed a boy on a bicycle, young, maybe 12. He stopped beside her and tilted his head. "Are you from that place?" Lan nodded. He hesitated. "Is it haunted?" Lan paused, then said softly, "It was." The boy blinked. "Not anymore?" She looked at the sky, at the rising sun behind her, at the trees that no longer leaned too far inward. She said, "No. Now it remembers." He nodded, then pedaled away, and Lan kept walking. The road stretched ahead, quiet, cracked, and full of silence that no longer hurt. But that night, in another town, in a guest room filled with dust and forgotten furniture, Lan awoke at 2:14 a.m. The room was still, too still. She sat up and found something beneath her pillow. She pulled it free. It was soft, wrapped in black silk. She unfolded it slowly. Inside, a tooth, small, smooth, unfamiliar, but not cold. Tied around it was a thread, red, and a note handwritten in delicate slanted ink, for the next one who forgets. Lan stared at it for a long, long time, then folded the cloth again, tied the thread, and placed it inside her suitcase. Not as a curse, not as a burden, as reminder that the dead are only dangerous when we stop listening.